not sure if there is an ideal sourcing map, so maybe I'm going to disappoint you in my answer. But I think what we know is that we are living in a very complex and ever-changing world, and business needs to be resilient and proactive in how they approach their sourcing practices. And they will therefore constantly need to reevaluate their risk and the opportunities. And there's, of course, different factors that we'll need to take into account, including the nature of the products that they want to import. So that is really a key driver of where the decision comes from. But it's the products they want to import, the quality they would have, the sourcing location, the nature of their supply chain and complexity, the sustainability risk associated to it. And just to give you an example here, why it is really relevant to consider the type of products. Some products like food products, fresh food products, you want to have them locally sourced because you want to have them fresh on the table. But others, for example, if you look into high-tech electronics, where there's a longer, more complex way of working it, they can come from further away. And sometimes they have to come from further away because that's where some of the ingredients and components are coming from. So having sourcing, saying an ideal sourcing is local or an ideal sourcing is global, I don't think we can say that. Sourcing is most optimized when it's really linked to the product of the value that you want to add here. So there's not one size fits all approach at all. And it's part of a balancing strategy. So you have to consider the product type, the cost of it, sustainability, the resilience of the supply chain, diversity of the supply chain, the quality. You have to take into account the regulations that are within those countries, lead times as well. You know, what are your lead times? Do you want to have them short or longer? That comes with a cost. Logistics is an important element of it, including also the cost as well as lead times, acting with also the customer preferences. So it may involve, in essence, a combination of local and global sourcing to meet your definite objectives, but also adapt to changing circumstances. And we have seen that with COVID-19, when supply chain disruptions were really taking place, why it is really, really relevant that, you know, if you diversify your supply chain, because you don't want to have your risk in one place. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket here. So flexibility as well as continuous innovation are really key to creating a very effective sourcing strategy. If I take it back to Amfori, what we do, we support our members in improving the ESG performance of their supply chain. Whether the supply chain is global or local, that doesn't matter. And if we look into sourcing in the public debate, there is, of course, a discussion, the need to source locally, because it's very often linked to environmental considerations. The idea is if you source local, you know, your environmental footprint is lower. And that to some extent might be true, but not always feasible depending on the products that you have. We have a tool in place that's called Amfori BEPI, Amfori Business Environmental Performance Initiative. And really, we are encouraging our members to look at the environmental risk that are really material in a sense, important to their supply chain. And based on that materiality analysis, then prioritize how they can improve the environmental performance and how they can mitigate risk. Because knowing your risk is one thing, you also need to act upon those and reducing those. So sustainability is increasingly, I would say, a key factor with really strong prominence in sourcing strategy of an organization. And just to be very clear, that's not only environmental, that also does include social aspects such as human rights and working conditions. And what we see is that both environment, E, as social, human rights, labor rights, as well as G, good governance, are equally important and must be addressed also in responsible supply chain practices. And it should be being included, say, in the core strategies of organizations to make sure, you know, that companies take the right decisions here. So what does ESG, environmental, social, governance, performance? If you want to do that well, if you understand where you want to be, you will need to carry out proper due diligence to make sure that you identify, assess, prioritize, but also prevent and remediate risks. And that is not just anymore a nice to have or a choice, but we do have increasing legislative pressure that business due diligence is needed, and business due diligence and also due diligence of their entire value chain is really at the core of sustainable trade. And I think I'm going to pause here now because I think I realize it's a lengthy answer to your question here. Before I'm going to move there, how we can improve it, maybe just one word on, say, responsible business or responsible purchasing practice, because I did mention it very briefly when I finished the response to my first question. Responsible purchasing practices is something that we all should embrace. And if we do that, we also know that we're focusing on the right things. And that is really making sure you also have the right linkages with all the actors that play a role within the, say, the entire value chain. And having, say, this collaborative dialogue and moving forward to make sure that we find solutions here. Linking that back to how can sustainability and global trade be improved, I just want to say that trade is a good thing. Global trade is also a good thing. It has really, really brought us a lot in the world. It has created many job opportunities in countries that are now really have developed, where it has lifted many people worldwide out of poverty. But we also know that it has downsides. Not everything is done properly in global trade. And that is why putting sustainability at the heart of global trade is so important, because it's really making the connection to, doing the right thing for people, doing the right thing for planet, but also focusing in prosperity for society, but also prosperity for a company, which we then would call profit. So it also means that global trade doesn't operate in a vacuum anymore. And for example, in Europe, the decision was made that in any of the free trade agreements that they conclude with their trading partners, countries, they will include what they call a TSD chapter. And a TSD chapter really stands for Trade and Sustainable Development Chapter, which really focuses on sustainability, on do it right environmentally, doing it right socially, but also having good governance in place. And that's for us also why we, from an Amfori perspective, where we say sustainable trade is at the core of what we do, the work that we do. And that's what we call in our Amfori language, trade with purpose. So we are advocating for pragmatic legislation, but also ambitious legislation, because we really want to move forward and have a positive impact. And ambitious sustainable trade policies can create what they would call an enabling environment for business and society to thrive, and really incentivize, say, respect for existing international standards on human rights and environmental considerations. And by creating new business opportunities, a good trade policy can really incentivize local governments to ensure that trade doesn't harm and does not lead to negative environmental impacts or exploitation of workers, and hence drive progress in the country. And there's many examples that it did do that for countries. But good trade policy will also clarify the conditions in which business needs to operate, because also business has their responsibilities, and really also encourages business to look beyond profit only, making sure, therefore, that, say, the balance between people, planet, and profit is there also from a business perspective. Of course, trade policies are not the only driver. I think also have to, we have to be realistic here, but they're very important. But we also need to make sure that we say the carrot and the stick approach here. So we need the carrot, which is trade policies. If you do well, there's advantages. Procurement policies, and also if you do well, there's advantages, but also any measures to really support those, including capacity building, but also to some extent the stick approach. And the stick approach is that there's legislation in force, due diligence regulations, but also enforcement if expectations and regulations and standards are not being met. And this is not something that we change very easily. It's a massive challenge, and it takes all of us to take a part, but we need also all the forces and all the collaboration, a lot of tools to really make sure that we have this positive impact. So, and when I say all of us, I mean business, I mean collaborative initiatives such as Amfori. It takes governments, it takes civil society, it takes consumers who also have a voice here, and their voice is getting stronger. It takes investors to change that ecosystem. we at Amfori, we really believe in the power of collaboration. We are, as I already said, we are a collaborative initiative. We are driven by our members, around 2,500 of those in food, retail, garments industry, but not only. And by fostering this collaboration between government, businesses, and civil society organizations, that's how we best develop and implement and enforce sustainable business initiatives and best practices. Similar to collaboration, if I already said you do it together, it also means that you share the responsibility. It's not that only one actor is responsible. It must be shared among the various stakeholders, because everyone has a unique role to play in really promoting responsible business practices. And maybe just a step back, what lays maybe at the foundation of responsible business practice are the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Those also include environmental considerations. And they are very clear about rules. They say it's the government's responsibility to protect the people on the planet. It's business, it's the government duty to protect people and planet. It's the business responsibilities to respect and make sure that everyone can enjoy the rights. And of course, if things go wrong, we need access to remedy. So those UN guiding principles already set those standards where it really says there's distinct responsibilities, but all of us, have a share in there. If we go back to, say, practicalities here, how does the supply chain work? Retailers, companies involved in global trade, they're really at the front line when it comes to sourcing, manufacturing, and distributing products. So they have therefore an important responsibility to adopt sustainable practice within their supply chain. And there is the expectation today that companies must be responsible for ensuring that the products they sell, they are sourced and manufactured ethically and sustainably. And that doesn't matter how big or small a company is. Everyone has a responsibility to take those factors in consideration. But it also has to make sure that we really make sure that we comply with environmental standards and expectations, with fair labor practices, but also, for example, in sourcing raw materials where there can be a huge impact on the environment as well as on communities. And that's where we need due diligence. And due diligence is not a concept. And I hear that quite often when I'm traveling, for example, in Asia Pacific or in Latin. This is a Western standard that's being imposed on us. It's not. Due diligence already comes from the UN guiding principles of business human rights that are already explained earlier before. Due diligence is already a long time consistent concept within the OECD. And due diligence is just an opportunity to understand your risks, mitigate those, and by doing so contribute, I would say, to a better impact on your bottom line from a business perspective, a better impact, a positive impact on people, and a better impact, a positive impact on environment. That's I think a very difficult and challenging question that you're asking here. There is sometimes this notion that, say, big buyers push the responsibilities to their suppliers, and that might not be perceived as being the right thing, and it is not really the right thing, because it's a shared responsibility, as I already said, and the complexity of a supply chain makes it really difficult for business to have full transparency, and you will need, say, also have, say, full responsibility to also make sure they do the right thing, but also that, say, the responsibilities are allocated correctly, and that you hold your business partner accountable. And there's two things I want to say about accountability. Is first of all, we mentioned we use the word supply chain. I also do the same, and supply chain is because that's a word that we're all very much familiar with. But there is this direction that we are really starting to think about value chain. And I think if I put it in simple word, a supply chain is still focused very much on production, from the understanding that was where previously was the biggest risk. Value chain encompasses everything where you have a business relation with. That can also be a sponsoring contract. It can also be the contract that you have with your distributors on your products. So it's really, say, the entire ecosystem, and in the entire ecosystem there can be risks. There's no, I would say, specific sector without risk. There's also no country without risk. Even in what we be considered low-risk countries, it doesn't mean no risk. There can always be issues. But the discussion in, say, where the responsibility is, given the complexity, should therefore not so much be about whether it's a tier 1 or a tier 2 or a tier 3 supplier, but it should be about what is your business leverage. And your business leverage is first and foremost where there is a direct contractual relationship, because that gives you leverage. There's in your contracts as a buyer, you put in your conditions. And the conditions are to that supplier, you will have to prove to me that what you produce is done in line with social and environmental standards and expectations. But it's also about how much leverage you have. You can have a contractual relationship, but if what you source as a buyer is only 1% of the overall, I would say, production in a factory, your leverage is also not that great. So I think leverage, business leverage, is an important concept, but not easy. But it links back to indeed to contractual relationship. And it links also back to how much, how important you are to that specific supplier, and therefore how much influence you have. If we want to monitor and ensure compliance, sustainability at all levels, retailers, buyers, they can mitigate these risks beyond responsibility. And beyond responsibility, it's also a strategic decision for business, because you don't want to have those risks. You want to really make sure that the risks are as small as possible, that you understand them, and that you can act into those risks. And if I come a bit more concrete about what these risks could be a multitude of risks. But this could be issues such as forced labor, such as child labor, such as unsafe working conditions, or long working hours. And very often those risks are not in where you might have the direct business relationship with, from a retailer that sells ladies' clothes. And the same is really about, because those issues might be further down in the supply chain. And having said that, further down in the supply chain also doesn't mean you do not have zero leverage. You can still influence through your contractual relationship, your business relationship. So you will need to do it together, because otherwise we will not be able to tackle all the issues that we have. And of course, I mentioned here child labor, forced labor, overtime, diversity, discrimination, but the same counts for environmental impacts. Also there, issues such as deforestation or pollution, that's where we will need, beyond, say, your own activities and beyond your own direct business relationship, to really look into how can I influence that. And that's why you also need collective initiatives, because collectively, I think we're stronger than just individually. If you look at the retailers, yes, they have a really responsibility to ensure sustainability across their entire supply chain. And it's not only that addressing sustainability at these levels is not only ethical, right thing to do, but it's also essential, again, for risk management and meeting the social and environmental expectations of those consumers that already are very much conscious about the negative impacts one can have, but also believe that business can be a force for good in driving positive impact. And we see that consumers are more and more concerned with, what are the ethical and environmental aspects of the products they buy. And of course, it has to be the balance between the right price, the right quality, as well as how it's being produced. So not only the what you buy, but also the how it's being produced. And more and more companies are very much aware of this, and are working hard to meet those, say, expectations from their consumers, just because it makes business sense. I find that a bit of a difficult question, because we don't have, say, benchmarks there where I really could give you hard data. But because there has already been so much scrutiny on fashion, on fast fashion, the fashion industry, they have really made, I would say, immense progress in the recent years towards sustainability. And some of the brands and retailers are more advanced than others, but I would say in general within the fashion industry, they know their risks, they understand the challenges, and they really try to work towards a better world. But the challenges are unique because they're very much tailored to what they do in fashion. So textile supply chains are very complex and very fragmented. They are one of the most globalized value chains, so that in itself poses already a risk. There is a lot of, say, levels or a lot of tiers in the supply chain, but also a lot of subcontracting, including homework for, say, specific tasks that are being done by workers who work at home, where it's very difficult to control their working conditions. So ensuring sustainability at all levels is by no means an easy task. In addition, there is very strong competition. Not only competition in the sense, who has whatever, do they produce it in the right colors or in the right, say expectations of what fashion should look like, but also with regards to price. And if we look into the volume of important products, we also have to recognize that in Europe, we have hardly any fashion industry left anymore. Over 70% of fashion products consumed in the European market are being imported. So there's still a portion that's being produced, say, locally, but even those probably will have some international components and international supply chain there. And I think one other thing here is that we talk about fashion and the supply chain. Many actors within that supply chain are small and medium enterprises because they are really representing the far majority in the ecosystem. Therefore, because they're small and medium enterprises, they might not have necessarily always the right resources to deal with sustainability, to understand the topics. That's why they need help. That's why I think collaboration and collaborative initiative also come into play to give that helping hand and to build a capacity. So that I think would say that's quite unique for the fashion supply chain here. One of the specific challenges in the fashion industry is that, say, in fashion, we also see that the far majority of the workers in the fashion industry are women, 70%. And we also know that women are amongst vulnerable groups across the world. So special attention will need to be paid to that element to make sure that women are treated fairly, that they're not being discriminated, that they are being paid, say, in a similar manner as men, but also that they are being given the opportunity to combine earning an income in work with their duties and responsibilities at home. So there's really specific challenges and risks to the fashion supply chain. And that's also the reason why Europe, it's currently still a proposal in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, has included textile fashion as a high-risk sector where we should have a specific focus on from a sustainability perspective here. One element I would like to add here is also, I spoke a bit about people, women, as specific issues within the supply chain within fashion. But fashion also is a big contributor to, say, to climate change. If we look into the figures of the World Bank, the fashion industry is responsible for 10% of annual global carbon emission. And that is a lot. And that's more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. So within the fashion industry, reducing the impact on climate and reducing, say, the greenhouse gas emissions, is an important element of the sustainability strategy. Just one figure here. If we don't do anything, the fashion industry greenhouse gas emissions will surge more than 50% by 2030. And that's not something that we should, let happen. So there's really, I would say, an important lever here where we can all work on. I mentioned in the beginning that within Amfori, our members that help with the due diligence, their supply chain are in food, retail, garment, and fashion industry. But I didn't mention how much of them are. It's around 1/3 of our members are in the fashion industry. So it means that also we collectively, with our members, really hope that we can have a positive impact here. And we do that by asking them to commit to our code of conduct, which is based on international standards socially, and which is based on environmental, I would say, expectations in improving, but also jointly, carry out due diligence efforts to see where we can do better. And by doing better, improve the sustainability performance of the supply chain.